Today, I'm going to tell you a story. For some of you, this story may be a memory, and for others of you, this might be a history lesson. Today, our story begins in the quiet confines of an 8th floor office in a building in Minsk, Belarus. On a June day in 2010, an email arrived. This email was simple, but irrevocably altered the course of history. See, on that June day, an email arrived from an Iranian client who reported mysterious, repeated disruptions to their industrial control systems. This would prompt an investigation, which then led to a sinister truth. A silent, malicious code, unleashed via an innocuous flash drive, had infiltrated Iran's computer networks. And that worm infected 58% of the computers in Iran. Created in secrecy by the intelligence agencies of the United States and Israel, Stuxnet heralded a dawn of unprecedented warfare. This warfare was defined by clandestine and highly sophisticated cyber attacks. Today, we're going to look at the impacts of Stuxnet. We're going to talk about the technical side of Stuxnet, and then we're going to introduce some frameworks in international relations and international warfare. Armed with this knowledge, we'll use some data, R, statistics, combine it all together, and look at just how similar or different is cyber warfare from traditional warfare. And then we're going to take all of this, and we're going to talk about how we together can collectively guarantee security. Like I said, we're going to talk about the technical parts of Stuxnet. On that June day in 2010, when Stuxnet was discovered, it was just a 500 kilobyte computer worm that successfully infected 14 industrial sites in Iran and spilled over into many other countries. But what was the purpose of Stuxnet? And what impact did it have on critical infrastructure? That answer lies in its devastating capabilities. Stuxnet exploited vulnerabilities, zero-day vulnerabilities, in the Siemens Step 7 software. Stuxnet infiltrated Iran's nuclear facilities and caused centrifuges to spin out of control at dangerous speeds. The consequences of Stuxnet were profound. The United States and Israel had successfully set back Iran's nuclear ambitions, and they demonstrated the alarming vulnerability of critical infrastructure to cyber attacks. At its core, Stuxnet was truly a marvel of engineering. It utilized 4 zero-day exploits, rootkit techniques, and a sophisticated payload delivery mechanism that allowed it to propagate over air-gapped networks. Its creators ingeniously crafted the worm to exploit those multiple zero-day vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows. Once inside a target system, Stuxnet propagated with unprecedented speed and stealth. It then employed a rootkit technique, which allowed it to stay hidden. Moreover, Stuxnet demonstrated remarkable adaptability, with modular components, those rootkit parts being changed in and out. It allowed its creators to update and configure it remotely. Stuxnet and its modular design achieved polymorphism for the first time, or one of the first times. But perhaps, and my favorite part of Stuxnet, was its digital fingerprinting technique. Stuxnet knew it could exploit vulnerabilities in the Siemens Step 7 software. So when it landed on a target machine, it checked, step 2 here, it checked and saw, am I on a Siemens machine? If it was on a Siemens machine, it would then update. Stuxnet was able to go, reach out to the servers from the United States and Israel, and it would pull down an updated version, or it'd pull down some information that it needed to make it a little polymorphic and change. That way antivirus couldn't pick up. And then it would utilize its zero-day vulnerabilities. After that, it would gain control. And Stuxnet was not about taking data. At least we don't think it is. Instead, Stuxnet's entire job was to spin fans really fast until those fans broke. Stuxnet kind of figured out that when you spin things and you make them speed up and then slow down, things just kind of... Yet Stuxnet was not just a tool of sabotage. It was a harbinger in a new era of warfare. Stuxnet brought about this new digital age, this one where wars are no longer fought with bullets and bombs, but instead they're fought with cybersecurity. Stuxnet changed how we do warfare. So let's talk about warfare. And before we can do that, we need to talk about what causes war and really kind of what prevents war. And this is going to set the stage for what we talk about next. So if you're not into international relations or politics, just hold on, we're getting to the tech. So the first thing we need to talk about is called the democratic peace theory. The democratic peace theory is one of those foundational things in international relations. It's a concept that suggests something truly remarkable. It says that democracies tend to avoid conflict with other democracies. This dates back to the Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant. Speed up to the 20th century, and scholars have built this out to be a model of peace. The 20th century version of the democratic peace theory says that democratic values, norms, and institutions create a sense of shared understanding between democracies. This theory challenges the traditional realist perspective, which argues that countries and nations are all just in a power struggle. The democratic peace theory gives us a refreshing view and says that we can, in fact, have peace. The second thing we need to talk about, and this one's a little bit more complex, is called selectorate theory. Selectorate theory is a fascinating concept, and it talks about how leaders make decisions, why leaders make decisions, and how they maintain power. Selectorate theory argues that a leader keeps their eye on the winning coalition. The winning coalition is the group of people who have the ability to keep the leader in power. And we're going to talk about the winning coalition versus the selectorate. The selectorate is the group of people who select the leader. Sometimes those are a very similar thing, and sometimes those are very different. So, in a democracy, everyone who can vote is part of the selectorate. We have the choice of who we pick. But if you vote for the winning party, or you are voting for a party, a candidate, and that candidate is winning, you're part of the winning coalition. This looks a little bit different in autocracies, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. So what you need to understand is that leaders want to keep their winning coalition larger than half of the selectorate, or large enough to keep them in power. And they have two ways of doing this. The first one, leaders can make use of public or private goods to win the loyalty of that selectorate, the group of people that can pick them. A public good is a good that's shared by everyone in a country. They are non-rivalrous. Non-rivalrous means that everyone can use them, and one person's usage does not undermine another person's usage. They're also non-excludable. That means that you cannot practically exclude somebody from their use. So think of things like clean air, things that access to water. Those kind of things are really hard to exclude people from. Leaders can also use private goods. Private goods are given to a specific individual. They are rivalrous. That means if one person has that good, other people can't. So think of positions of power. This is particularly true in autocracies. Private goods are also excludable. Excludable meaning that you can take that good away from people or give it to others. In the context of winning a war, or rather not losing a war, a leader who successfully navigates conflict and emerges victorious bolsters their domestic support and enhances their winning on the world stage. So winning a war, or not losing a war, is a public good. When you lose a war, there's devastating consequences, so leaders want to win wars. But here's where things get interesting. We're going to start mixing selectorate theory and democratic peace theory. Selectorate theory highlights the importance of maintaining a broad base of support. Leaders need to consider the interests of their people, or their selectorate. And when they go to pick wars, selectorate theory helps to create a perpetual cycle where democracies choose not to go into conflict because of the risk of losing a war. But in an autocracy, the selectorate is much smaller. So this virtuous cycle of mixing the democratic peace theory and not going to war and selectorate theory kind of breaks down. So in the context of autocracies, selectorate theory takes on this particularly interesting dimension. Unlike democracy, where leaders require a broad base of support, autocratic leaders depend on a much smaller group, sometimes families, elites, business powers, right? So in an autocracy, the difference between the selectorate and the winning coalition is much smaller than the democracy and the winning coalition. So what this tells us is autocracies do not need to use public goods, or not as frequently as democracies. So if winning a war, or rather not losing a war, is a public good, and autocracies don't need those public goods, they're less choosy when it comes to picking a fight. If you don't have a base of support to lose, they'll pick the fight. So this brings us to my research question, which is, does democratic peace, the concept we introduced before, hold in cyber warfare? Or is this only a traditional warfare concept? Think about Stuxnet, where it took so long for people to figure out who created Stuxnet. Cyber warfare has minimal attribution. So are democracies more likely to pick fights because they might be less likely to get caught? We're going to answer that question. And so as we embark on this journey, this quest of unraveling the complexities of cyber warfare in the context of democratic peace, we have to set forward two hypotheses. The first hypothesis, democracies will utilize cyber operations less frequently than non-democracies. This is building on that picking a fight thing. Democracies have more to lose if they lose a war, or democratic leaders. Autocratic leaders, they're not as worried about losing a war. The second hypothesis, democracies exhibit a lower propensity to target other democracies compared to dyadic or two-way relations characterized by regime classifications. So what this is saying is, this is our operationalization of the democratic peace theory. Two democracies are not going to, or a democracy is not going to attack another democracy in the same way an autocracy will. To test this, we rely on two data sets. The first one's called the Cyber Operations Tracker from the Council on Foreign Relations. The Cyber Operations Tracker meticulously cataloged cyber operations starting in about 2005, and they're still going to this day. They include the state-sponsored hacking group, they include the sponsor nation, they include the victim nation, they include the target, they include sources, give it a title and a date. The second thing we're going to look at is what's called the democracy dictatorship data set. And this is one of those data sets in international relations, political science that pretty much everyone knows. The DD data set, democracy dictatorship, utilizes 4 criteria to classify nation states as either a democracy or a dictatorship, or sometimes something in between. So we're going to mesh these together, and we're going to look at this illuminating interplay between politics, security, and technology. And so here's our data set. And I utilized R. So if you're familiar with R, I have some R code in here, and you'll notice these are screenshots from RStudio. So as I was saying, our cyber data, our cyber operations data, I read it into a data frame inside R. And you'll see that we have a title, the date, affiliation, the description of the attack, a response, victims, the sponsor, the type, all of these things. What matters most to us today, we're going to be looking at the victims. The victims are typically, but not always, nation states. And we're going to have to sort that out. And we're going to be looking at the sponsor. The sponsors are state sponsors. So, for example, North Korea sponsors the Lazarus Group. So North Korean state-sponsored hacking groups are categorized as affiliation. The affiliation will be the state-sponsored group, and then the sponsor is going to be the nation. So we're worrying about victims and sponsor. And so the first thing I had to do was sort this data, and it's not in a standard format. So here's sort of the process for sorting this data. So we have all of our data, And we asked the question, does the data point have at least one victim and at least one sponsor? There were some data points that were incomplete, meaning maybe we knew that X, Y, and Z countries were hacked, but we didn't know where it came from. So we had to remove that data. Keep this in mind because this is going to change the statistics a little bit or have an impact on the success of this project. So if they had at least one victim and one sponsor, it was considered complete data, and it moved on to the second round. So then we asked the question, does the data have at least one victim and at least one sponsor that are nation-state or nation-state affiliated entities? And this one's kind of intriguing. While sorting out the data, we noticed that North Korea loves to attack crypto exchanges. Those crypto exchanges are decentralized, they're not tied to a government. So we take out a lot of data from North Korea. And then we also notice that there are a lot of attacks on sort of entities right on the outside of a government. So they're going to attack maybe lobbying groups or politicians. I consider those nation-state affiliated entities. If it's involved in the political process, the government process, something that is unique to that government. I even included things like nations ISP. So an ISP that's specific to Norway is in my data set. We included this because the attempt from the hacker group, when looking at the description and the sources, it tells us that they're trying to take down the internet in the country. They're trying to impact the nation as a whole. They're not attacking against a company because they don't like the company. There were attacks against Coca-Cola. Those got removed because Coca-Cola is a multinational corporation. We're not going to consider them part of this data set. So if the data passes this check, then we consider it suitable. And that's the first round of data processing. So when we talked about Stuxnet, we said that it was built by the United States and by Israel together in cooperation. So then how do we measure how two nations attack another nation? So we asked the question, are there two or more victims or two or more sponsors? Because sometimes we have one country attacking 50 countries at the same time with the same exploit. So if there are two or more sponsors, we split those out. So for every sponsor, we list every victim. So for example, with Stuxnet, built by the United States and Israel, so then we list out United States, Iran, Israel, Iran, because they're attacking Iran. Same way with victims. If we have multiple victims, we would attribute that sponsor to all of their victims as individual data points. We're essentially just expanding this, kind of multiplying them together, if you will. So we split those out, and then the next thing we do is we code it with what's called DD, the democracy dictatorship. So if a nation is a democracy, or rather they have democratic institutions, they're called a democracy in the DD. They get a value of 1. If the nation is an autocracy, according to DD, they get a value of 0. So we're going to split those. We split out the victims, and then we start coding them. And all this was about 1,400 data points, and it was all done by hand because there was nothing that was remotely similar or able to be scripted. It was just, this data set that we're working with is just kind of a conglomerate of information that you then have to sleuth through. I'm sure there's a better way to sort of do that I didn't have to do it by hand, but I just didn't have the mechanism. So we process all of our data, and we come up with some pretty interesting findings. The first thing we found is that, and this is a different way of doing the regime type in DD, they have a 6-fold regime type. And it splits out the top 3 as democracies and the other 3 as dictatorships. What we found by just doing a relative frequency on the entire data set is that dictatorships use cyber operations significantly more frequently than democracies. But not only that, specifically civilian dictatorships. So a civilian dictatorship is, think of Russia, think of North Korea. A civilian dictatorship is not like the dictatorships we see most frequently in Africa, which are military dictatorships where military runs the nation. And they're not royal dictatorships like Saudi Arabia, where they have a king that leads. So we found that civilian dictatorships use cyber operations significantly more. So if we recall selectorate theory from earlier, it looks here that maybe democracies are a little more choosy in picking fights as compared to dictatorships. And then here's the relative frequency when we condense the top three, the democracies, into what we're called one. Is the democracy present? If yes, one. So, and we're going to combine these civilian dictatorships, ones and zeros. When we combine those, what we find is that about 87% of the attacks in this data set came from dictatorships, or they came from a nation where democracy is not present. Further reinforcing what we're talking about in selectorate theory, where nations are more choosy in picking a fight. And so if you're familiar with R, here's sort of my code for R. We're reading the data in. We're calculating the relative frequency, which is just the number of times that 1 or 0 appears divided by the length. It's just a percentage. We're spitting that out into our nice graphs. And then down here, instead of going in the data set and recoding the zeros, ones, twos as ones and zeros for the presence of democracy, we just utilize it here in R. We just rewrite regime type as a 1 or a 0. And then we repeat that relative frequency process, and we make a graph. So these graphs here were generated from that code. So now we have to look at our second hypotheses. And so here's our data set, or a snapshot of our data set, the head of our data set. And what you'll see is there aren't any great examples here, but we have our victims and our sponsors. We've already split them out, and we've coded with that DD, the 1 or the 0, the presence of democracy. And then we've coded the sponsor as a 1 or a 0. And we have to create a new sort of dummy variable, if you will. And this is called interaction. The interaction is the sum of the DD and the sponsor. So if you have two nations that are democracies, the sum would be 2. So the interaction is coded 2. If you have two nations that are autocracies, the interaction is 0. And if you have one nation that's an autocracy and one nation that's a democracy, the sum is 1. So that's our interaction variable. And we're going to be utilizing this interaction variable to do our statistical analysis here. So what you'll find with the interaction as compared to the percent of total attacks is that there are a lot more attacks in the 1 category. So that means there are a lot of democracies or autocracies attacking other countries. The democratic peace theory does not say that democracies are less likely to attack anyone. It says they're less likely to attack other countries. So it's kind of hard to use this data set if we include this. What we do find is that the interaction makes a statistical significance, or there's a statistically significant difference between these interactions. We're using chi-squared testing with a degree of freedom 1. If you don't know stat, chi-squared is this really messy formula comparing observed versus expected observation. And our p-value here, that's the number we're interested in. What our p-value tells us is when it's really, really small, there is more likely to be a relationship between the two things we're measuring, so the interaction variable and the percent total. But like I said, this one thing is a little nebulous because our theories don't tell us about the use of aggression against just other nations. So when we take out that one variable and we just look at homogeneous interactions versus the percent total, so both countries are either autocracies or either democracies, what we find is that there are significant difference between how often autocracies target each other versus how often democracies target each other. So in effect, what we have found is that our hypotheses, way back here, that democracies are less likely to use cyber operations and that democracies exhibit a lower propensity to attack other democracies, holds true. And so here's the data for that. We're still using R. We're still reading in the data. we're using what's called chi-square testing, and R does it all for us. We print out our graphs. We create our homogeneous interaction variable. So we say that if interaction is 0 or 2, keep it, otherwise remove it. And then we do our chi-square testing again and print out our second graph. So lessons learned. Kind of as we conclude our exploration here into the dynamics of cyber warfares and the interaction with democratic peace, several key lessons emerge that inform our understanding of modern conflict. First and foremost, our analysis underscores the enduring relevance of democratic peace theory in shaping international relations, even in the realm of cyberspace. The evidence suggests that democratic nations are indeed less likely to engage in cyber aggression against one another, highlighting the stabilizing influence of shared democratic values and institutions. Second, we find that there is value in empirical research and data-driven analysis when informing policymaking and strategic decision-making, especially when dealing with the complexities of cyber warfare. Finally, our exploration into the realm of cyber warfare serves as a reminder for the evolving nature of conflict in the digital age. As technology continues to grow and cyberspace becomes more and more prevalent, it is essential to remain vigilant in our approach to cybersecurity and international relations. So I've done my work. As any good scholar, where can we improve? And maybe one of you guys will take this information and run. One area ripe for further investigation is the role of emerging technology and such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, in shaping the landscape of conflict. By exploring how these technologies influence the capabilities and strategies of state actions in cyberspace, we can anticipate future trends and develop proactive measures to addressing emerging threats. So one idea I have in here, let's say artificial intelligence, quantum computing, helps nations to minimize attribution. A lot of cyber attacks are still getting tracked back to people. So can we sort of measure how these emerging technologies impact attribution and then how that impacts the state's decision? Additionally, there needs to be continued research into the impacts of international norms and legal frameworks on cybersecurity behavior. One example is capitalistic peace and autocratic peace, which are sort of the sister theories to the democratic peace theory. It says that autocracies are less likely to attack each other because they're autocracies. Capitalistic peace says that two capitalistic nations are less likely to attack each other. It's all just building on shared values and shared norms. Furthermore, future research could delve deeper into the motivations and intentions of state actors engaged in cyber aggression, particularly in relation to democratic peace. So as a one-man team doing this research project, there was a lot of data that was a little incomplete, or the victims weren't quite clear. So one example I can remember, in our data set, it says maybe multiple Middle Eastern countries were attacked. Well, we can't measure multiple Middle Eastern countries in the way I did my data. So with some research into those specific incidents, with more time, a larger team, we could attribute all of those data points to nations. We could find the actual nation's victims. Finally, there's a growing need for interdisciplinary research that bridges the gap between technical cybersecurity expertise and broader considerations. By fostering collaboration between experts of different fields, we can develop holistic approaches to cybersecurity that address the multifaceted nature of cyber threats and promote greater resilience in the face of ever-evolving challenges. So in conclusion, as we kind of reflect on this journey before I start taking some questions, there are several key lessons that emerge. We are again reminded of the strategic importance of empirical decision-making and data-driven analysis. Looking ahead, we find promising opportunities for future research to further deepen our understanding of cyber warfare. In closing, our explore collaboration. We can navigate the complexities of cyberspace more effectively and work towards a more secure and resilient global ecosystem. All right, questions? Yeah.
So at the
Yes.
Which then led to a conclusion of democratic nations are attacking other democratic nations less often. However, wouldn't they also have more interest in shielding the fact that they were the one that did the attack? In other words, the United States could make an attack look like it came from somebody like North Korea. How do you know that the data is clean?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest issues with this data. Certainly, the data we're working with may have some uncleanliness in it. And that was one of the sort of future research ideas: bigger team, more time, more money. Research is expensive. But minimal attribution sort of is a huge deal. Think what would happen if the United States was able to pull things off like Stuxnet on a regular basis, but no one knew it came from us. Why would we not engage in power play and power dynamics? The issue with, or why really selectorate theory, democratic peace theory are able to tentatively hold in cyber warfare is because we can attribute attacks. We can attribute these things at some point. Stuxnet took many, many years to figure out. But these things I would hypothesize, and we're not seeing it enough, that these start to break down when we can't pinpoint who's doing the attack. I think cyber warfare is one of those places where it's most likely to break down because it's really, I would argue, it's easier to tell what plane flies over your country and drops bombs than it is to tell where this random packet with some information or where this USB came from. So yeah, the data might have a little bit of uncleanliness, and that's certainly going to be an issue in the future. And I would like to think that as AI and all these emerging technologies help to increase the complexity of cyber attacks, it also has a chance for us to increase our defensive mechanisms. So I would hope, or I would like to think that there's a balancing act, that as there's more efforts to minimize attribution, there are equal efforts to also continue attributing things accurately. Yes?
I'm inclined to wonder if there may be certain kinds of actors that are more determined to hide their identity, more determined to prevent attribution. And it occurs to me that maybe if we could look at these attacks and see how long it took for us to find who the attacker was when we did find it. Is that kind of data available in the data set?
So the data doesn't have enough information about how attribution was found. Sometimes this is using things like tools, techniques, procedures, protocols. They're looking at sort of, we call it the pyramid of pain in cybersecurity. There are different things that we can look at to attribute an attack. Starting with basic things like IPs. Maybe in malware analysis, you might be thinking about file hashes, and they get more and more complex. But yeah, I would like to think that there are nations that like to hide things more, and I would say that democracies, or at least I'm making an educated guess here. I would make the guess that democracies are more likely to try to hide what they're doing because, again, they have to be choosy in picking their fights. And one of those choices might not be frequency, but it might be attribution. Think about Stuxnet, how long that took for people to kind of figure out. It was built together with the United States and Israel, and to this day, the United States really doesn't want to own up to it. So yeah, I think there are nation states that try to hide it. It would be interesting to kind of look at how long it takes to attribute things and use that maybe in conjunction with the level of attribution or a certainty that this is a nation. I think there are some really interesting patterns there. Unfortunately, that data is not readily available. I'm sure with some open source intelligence techniques, we could start to pull that data from somewhere.
How are you attributing, I know you mentioned North Korea attacking crypto exchanges, but how are you attributing, like, not necessarily state-sponsored, but state-protected groups? Like, I know there's several groups for a while running out of Russia that were doing attacks against hospital groups and locking down their systems.
Yeah, so the...
Is that considered a state attack in your
Yeah. So I didn't have to do much work when it came to picking a sponsor. This data set, the Council on Foreign Relations, they made the decision that if you're a state-sponsored group or significantly protected, and I'm not sure what the criteria they choose is, but every data point, for the most part, I think there were 16 that didn't, and they got removed as incomplete. All of the affiliations had a sponsor coded. But when we looked at, from a victim standpoint, I've included things like attacking a hospital, critical infrastructure, sort of state-protected entities were included as victims, coded to the nation that they were in. Exceptions would be something like Coca-Cola or multinational or even state corporations if they don't have a reasonable sort of tie to that nation. So think there was an attack on Honda and Toyota. Those didn't get attributed as a victim to a certain country because they're just pervasive in the global economy.
So Sony doesn't get counted when North Korea
Yes.
puts their stuff off.
Yes, so Sony did not get counted because it's kind of hard to figure out where we put Sony when it comes to being state-sponsored or not. Up there in the back.
Did you look at or adjust for what percentage of countries are democracies versus dictatorships in general? Because I can imagine if like 80% are dictatorships, we'd expect most attacks to be between dictatorships. But I realized I don't actually know what percentage are which.
Yeah, so there's certainly a little bit of a difference when it comes to how many democracies versus dictatorships. In this data set, I didn't explicitly adjust for that. Certainly that would make the results a little more accurate, and again, something I would like to add on. I'm actually working on adding on that right now before publishing here. But the data set ended up just about equal. The number of actors represented by both sides was equal, but not necessarily the number of attacks by both sides. Yes?
At some point, you were talking about the motivations for democratic countries not to attack, and you said that it was because basically if you lose a war, that's very bad for the leader. What does a failed cyber war look like?
So that's a good question. I would argue that a failed cyber attack, in my opinion, would be one that draws a response, or one that maybe impacts other things. So maybe a cyber attack that then leads to sanctions that are significantly damaging to a country. That I would consider that failed. How we measure failed is sort of nebulous, but the idea is that there can be negative consequences as a result of a cyber attack that is then attributed to that country. Yes, up in the back with the hat.
So, if we take a bit of a walk here, you said about like the public good and stuff like that, and your democratic nations rely more on that. And based on that assumption, we can assume that your democratic nations typically have a more educated populace, and therefore maybe a more capable populace. Do you feel like potentially this data set might be a little bit poisoned because it's kind of like the opposite survivorship bias, like we're counting the ones that we know of as opposed to the ones that are probably out there that we don't know of specifically, like you're looking at autocracy versus democratic, which you could boil much lower down to like higher education, lower education. We don't necessarily have a great view of those democratic attacks because maybe they're just better at hiding.
Yeah, so certainly, again, going back to attribution, there have been found not to really be correlations between democracy and autocracy and education. Especially think about the oil-rich countries in the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia, where they have taken surprising steps, in my opinion, towards furthering the public education available to them. So we can't necessarily make the argument that autocracies have less education. But yeah, certainly we might expect that one nation might be more capable than the other. But we're not measuring capability here, we're measuring frequency. You could adjust, I guess, for capability if you come up with an operationalization of that. And that's sort of one of those things in stat where every time we make a hypothesis and test it, there's another possible confounding variable that we'll want to control for. And so once we make that control for capability, we can now think of another thing to control for. And that's sort of the value of research in academia, is that we can take a starting place and now we can tweak it and control for something else and control for something else. And we can keep building more and more complex models that might more reasonably reflect the real world.
That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, everybody, for those very insightful questions, and a big round of applause for Ian here.